Sounds of the Deep. Chapter 1. The Sound from Below. The haunting melody drifted through the cramped lab, its ethereal tones echoing off the sterile white walls. Dr. Evelyn Marsh leaned closer to the speaker, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to decipher the strange, pulsing rhythm. It was unlike any whale song she had heard before in her decades of research. The long, undulating notes seemed to resonate on a frequency that spoke directly to some ancient, primal part of her brain. A chill ran down her spine, making the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Play it again," Evelyn murmured to herself, fingers flying across the keyboard as she isolated specific segments of the recording. The sound swelled, filling the small space. She closed her eyes, allowing the eerie song to wash over her. Buried within the keening cries, she thought she could detect patterns, a complex language waiting to be deciphered. It called to her, an insistent tug that she felt deep in her bones. She had to understand it, to unravel its secrets. As the last notes faded away, Evelyn sat back in her chair, a faint smile playing about her lips. This discovery could change everything, the way humanity understood these majestic creatures, the very nature of interspecies communication. A knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. "Evelyn? You in there?" She recognized the voice of her colleague, Dr. Richard Thorne. With a sigh, she rose and opened the door. Richard peered at her, his eyes narrowed with concern. "Christ, Evelyn, have you been here all night? You look like hell." Evelyn waved away his comment impatiently. "Never mind that. Listen to this." She ushered him inside, eager to share her findings. As the strange song filled the room once more, she watched Richard's face closely, hunting for a glimmer of the same wonder and fascination she felt. But his expression remained carefully neutral, his brow creased in thought. "It's certainly unusual," he allowed when the recording finished. "But I wouldn't jump to any conclusions just yet. We need to analyze it further, compare it to known vocalizations." "But don't you see?" Evelyn cut in, frustrated by his measured response. "This could be groundbreaking, a new form of communication, a window into their world." Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Look, I know you're excited, but we have to be cautious. There's a lot we still don't understand about whale song. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Evelyn bit back a sharp retort, trying to rein in her impatience. Richard was just being Richard, ever the voice of sober reason. She knew his caution came from a place of genuine concern, both for the work and for her own well-being. "You're right," she said at last, forcing a smile. "I'll run some more tests, see what I can find." Richard nodded, clearly relieved. "Good. And Evelyn, try to get some rest, okay? You're no good to anyone if you burn yourself out." With a final worried glance, he left her alone with her thoughts and the echo of that haunting underwater cry. But as Evelyn turned back to her computer, she knew she wouldn't be sleeping anytime soon. The siren song of the deep had her in its grasp, and she wouldn't rest until she unraveled its mystery, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. Sleepless Nights. The glow of the computer screen was the only light in the darkened bedroom, casting Evelyn's pale face in an eerie electric blue. On the monitor, spectrograms of the whale recording flashed by, each image searing itself into her exhausted brain. She had lost track of how long she'd been sitting there, poring over every frequency and amplitude. Minutes bled into hours, night into day, but still, the song consumed her. The bed beside her lay cold and empty. Her work had been her only bedfellow of late. The thought brought a wry, humorless smile to her lips. Her weary eyes flickered to the clock on the nightstand. 3:27 a.m. She should sleep, she knew. Even Richard, in his well-meaning worry, had said as much. But every time she closed her eyes, the song was there waiting for her, drifting through her dreams like an ancient lullaby. In those hazy, half-waking moments, the melody seemed to shift and change, taking on new, unsettling dimensions. Beneath the high, keening cries, she sometimes thought she heard a low, pulsing beat, like the thrum of a gigantic heartbeat. At other times, the notes warped into something almost human, a chorus of ghostly voices calling out to her from the fathomless depths. Evelyn shook her head, trying to clear the fog of fatigue. She was imagining things, surely, the product of an overtaxed mind, nothing more. She turned her attention back to the screen, frowning as she noticed an odd anomaly in the latest spectrogram. A series of regular, pulsing spikes, almost too faint to make out. They appeared at intervals throughout the recording, a strange counterpoint to the song's organic ebb and flow. With a sudden burst of manic energy, Evelyn isolated the anomalous segment and boosted the audio levels as high as her system would allow. A tinny, distorted sound filled the room, a scratchy white noise that set her teeth on edge. And there, just at the edge of perception, a faint pattern emerged. A series of clicks and pulses, too regular to be random, almost like Morse code. Evelyn's heart began to race. It was impossible, of course, some artifact of the recording process, or a quirk of the underwater environment. Whales didn't use human signaling systems. The very notion was absurd. And yet, as she listened, the pattern began to take on an eerie familiarity. Long pulses, short pulses, arranged in a sequence that tugged at some half-forgotten corner of her memory. With shaking hands, she reached for a pen and paper, scribbling down the pattern as it repeated. Dash dot 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 dash 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 dot dash dot dot SOS, the universal distress signal, over and over, hidden within the whale's song like a desperate cry for help from the lightless abyss. Evelyn stared at the paper, her mind reeling. It couldn't be real. It had to be a coincidence, a trick of her own subconscious. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. She wasn't imagining things. There was something embedded in that recording, something that defied all rational explanation. A message, a warning, or perhaps an invitation, a siren call luring her towards some dark and unspeakable truth. Evelyn shivered, suddenly chilled despite the stuffiness of her room. She glanced at the clock again. 4:15 a.m. The dead hours, when the world was at its quietest and the mind at its most vulnerable. She should try to sleep, to clear her head. But as she lay down on the bed, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, she knew it was futile. The song echoed in her thoughts, an unanswered question that would gnaw at her until she found its source. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take this to Richard. Together, they could make sense of it, bring the scientific method to bear on this impossible puzzle. But even as she made the resolution, a small, treacherous part of her recoiled at the thought. This mystery belonged to her, and her alone. To share it would be to dilute it, to risk losing the strange, dark wonder that had taken root in her soul. No, she would solve this herself, even if it meant descending into obsession. Even if it meant following that haunting melody to the very ends of the earth, or to the bottom of the fathomless sea. With that thought, Evelyn drifted into a fitful doze, the whale's song echoing through her troubled dreams like the tolling of a distant, subaquatic bell. Chapter 3. Voices in the Static. The lab was in chaos. Printouts littered every surface, graphs and spectrograms pinned haphazardly to the walls. In the center of it all, Evelyn sat hunched over her computer, her eyes bloodshot and her hair a tangled mess. She had been at it for hours, running the recording through every filter and analysis program she could think of, trying to isolate the strange pattern she'd heard the night before. But the more she listened, the more elusive it became, slipping in and out of the crackling background noise like a ghost. Come on, she muttered, her voice hoarse from too much coffee and too little sleep. I know you're in there. She adjusted the settings for what felt like the 100th time, boosting the high frequencies until the speakers hissed with static. And then, suddenly, there it was, a series of sharp, staccato pulses, buried deep within the white noise. Evelyn leaned forward, her heart pounding in her ears. It was the same pattern she'd heard before, the same eerie Morse code that had haunted her dreams. But now, isolate and amplified, it took on a new, unsettling clarity. SOS, SOS. The distress call repeated over and over, a desperate plea from the depths. But there was something else too, something that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Between the pulses, in the spaces where there should have been only silence, she heard a voice, a human voice, distorted and fragmented, drifting through the static like a drowning man's last gasp. Help me. The words were barely audible, a whisper on the edge of perception, but they were there, as clear and unmistakable as the song itself. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. This was impossible. Whales didn't use human language, didn't send distress signals in Morse code, and yet, the evidence was right there in front of her, defying all logic and reason. She played the segment again, straining to make out the words. Help me, please. The voice was male, she thought, though it was hard to tell through the distortion. It had a strange echoing quality, as if it were coming from a great distance or from deep underwater. A sudden knock at the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around to see Richard standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Evelyn, what's going on? I've been trying to reach you all day." Evelyn blinked, disoriented. Had it really been that long? She glanced at the clock on the wall, shocked to see that it was already late afternoon. I found something," she said, her voice shaking. "In the recording. You need to hear this." She gestured for him to come closer, hitting play on the isolated segment. The ghostly voice filled the room once more, pleading for help from the depths of the abyss. Richard frowned, leaning in to listen. "What the hell is that? Some kind of interference?" "It's not interference," Evelyn said, her eyes wide and feverish. "It's a voice, a human voice. Someone's down there, Richard. Someone's in trouble." Richard shook his head, his expression skeptical. "That's impossible. It must be some kind of artifact, a glitch in the recording." "It's not a glitch," Evelyn snapped, her frustration boiling over. "I've run every test, every analysis. It's real, Richard. As real as you or me." She ran a hand through her hair, trying to calm herself. "Look, I know how it sounds, but you have to trust me on this. We have to investigate, to find out what's going on." Richard sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Evelyn, listen to yourself. You're talking about some kind of, underwater distress call? From a human? It's crazy." "I know it's crazy," Evelyn said, her voice low and intense. "But it's the truth, and if we don't do something, if we don't try to help, then what's the point of any of this? What's the point of all our research, all our knowledge, if we can't use it to save a life?" Richard was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally he nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "All right," he said. "All right, we'll look into it. But Evelyn, you need to be careful. Don't let this consume you. Don't lose yourself in this." Evelyn nodded, a fierce light in her eyes. "I won't," she promised. "But I have to know, Richard. I have to find out what's down there, waiting in the dark." And with that, she turned back to her work, the ghostly voice still echoing in her mind, calling her onwards into the unknown depths. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. The ocean had always called to Evelyn. Ever since she was a little girl, growing up in a small coastal town, she had felt its pull, its strange and inexorable draw. She remembered standing on the rocky shore, watching the waves crash against the cliffs, feeling the salt spray on her face. She would spend hours there, exploring the tide pools and collecting shells, marveling at the alien beauty of the creatures that lived beneath the waves. Her father had been a fisherman, gone for weeks at a time on the deep-sea trawlers that plied the North Atlantic. When he was home, he would regale her with tales of the things he had seen out there on the open water: whales breaching under the midnight sun, massive schools of fish that moved like living silver, storms that raged for days without end. But there was a darkness to his stories too, a hint of something ancient and unknowable lurking beneath the surface. He spoke of strange lights in the depths, of eerie sounds that carried for miles through the underwater canyons. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't listening, he would mutter about the ones who never came back, the men who were lost to the sea without a trace. Evelyn had been fascinated by it all, even as a child. While other girls dreamed of princesses and fairy tales, she had lain awake at night, imagining herself on the deck of a ship, braving the fury of the elements in search of uncharted wonders. And now, all these years later, that same longing still burned within her. The whale song, the ghostly voice in the recording, they were just the latest siren call, drawing her onwards into the mystery. As she sat in her lab, surrounded by the detritus of her obsession, Evelyn's mind drifted back to those long-ago days by the sea. She remembered the ache she had felt then, the sense that there was something out there waiting for her, some destiny that she had yet to fulfill. It was the same ache she felt now, magnified 100-fold by the strange and impossible things she had discovered. The whale song had awakened something in her, some primal yearning that had lain dormant all her life. She closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. In her mind's eye, she saw herself as she had been back then, a skinny, sun-browned girl with tangled hair, and bright, curious eyes. She saw the rocky shore, the churning gray sea, the gulls wheeling overhead. And then, for just a moment, the memory shifted, warped by time and distance. The shore became a featureless expanse of black sand, the sea an oily, fathomless void. The gulls' cries deepened into something low and mournful, a sound that made her bones ache with a feeling she couldn't name. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. The vision had been so vivid, so real. For a moment, she had been sure she could smell the brine, feel the clammy touch of the water on her skin. She shook her head, trying to clear it. It was just a dream, a trick of her exhausted mind. She had been working too hard, pushing herself to the brink of collapse. Richard had been right about that much at least. But even as she told herself that, Evelyn knew it was more than just fatigue. The whale song had triggered something deep within her, some ancient memory or ancestral instinct. It was as if the ocean itself were calling to her, beckoning her to some dark and unknowable purpose. She looked around the lab at the chaos of her own making, the graphs and printouts, the endless hours of recordings. It all seemed so small now, so insignificant in the face of the vast and terrifying mystery that had opened up before her. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to see this through, to follow the song to its source, no matter where it might lead her. Even if it meant descending into the abyss itself, into the lightless depths where no human had ever ventured. With a shaky sigh, Evelyn turned back to her work, the ghostly voice still echoing in her mind. There were answers out there, she knew. Answers that might change everything, might rewrite the very history of life on Earth. And she would find them, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had ever known. Chapter 5. The Skeptic. The conference room was filled to capacity. A sea of eager faces turned towards the podium. Evelyn stood at the front, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice echoing through the room. "I know that what I'm about to present may seem unorthodox, even unbelievable, but I ask that you keep an open mind and consider the evidence before you." She clicked a button, and the screen behind her flickered to life. The now familiar spectrogram of the whale song appeared, its eerie curves and spikes etched in glowing lines. "This recording was captured several weeks ago," Evelyn said, her voice growing stronger as she fell into the familiar rhythm of the presentation. At first it appeared to be a typical example of humpback whale vocalizations, but upon further analysis, we discovered something extraordinary. She clicked again, and the ghostly voice filled the room, pleading for help from the depths. A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of shock and disbelief. Embedded within the whale song, Evelyn continued, is a human voice, a distress call, repeated in Morse code. We've analyzed it extensively, and there can be no doubt. Someone or something is down there, and they need our help. The murmur grew louder, a buzzing hum of excitement and confusion. Evelyn scanned the crowd, looking for a friendly face, but all she saw was skepticism, even hostility. And then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out. "Dr. Marsh, if I may?" Evelyn's heart sank. She knew that voice all too well. Dr. Thorne, her longtime rival and chief critic. "The floor is yours, Dr. Thorne," she said, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. The older man strode to the front, his gray hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He turned to face the audience, a condescending smile on his lips. "Dr. Marsh's enthusiasm is admirable," he began, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "But I'm afraid she's let her imagination run away with her." He gestured to the screen, where the spectrogram still glowed. "What we're hearing is nothing more than pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in random noise. Our brains are wired to seek out familiar shapes and sounds, even when they're not really there." Evelyn felt her cheeks burning with anger and humiliation. How dare he dismiss her work so casually, so cruelly? "With all due respect, Dr. Thorne," she said, struggling to keep her voice level. "I've run every test, every analysis. This is not a trick of the mind. It's real." Thorne shook his head, a patronizing chuckle escaping his lips. "Dr. Marsh, I understand your passion for your work, but you must see how absurd this is. A human voice calling for help from the bottom of the ocean? It's the stuff of science fiction, not serious research." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces hardening with doubt. Evelyn felt her heart sink, her dreams of vindication crumbling to dust. But then, From the front row, a hand shot up. Evelyn recognized the face. Dr. Amelia Chen, a young marine biologist with a reputation for unorthodox thinking. "Dr. Marsh," Chen said, her voice clear and confident, "I believe you. I've heard the recording, and I think you're onto something big." Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude, a flicker of hope rekindled in her chest. Perhaps she wasn't alone after all. But Thorne was already shaking his head, a sneer twisting his features. "Dr. Chen, with all due respect, you're hardly an expert in this field. I've been studying whale vocalizations for decades, and I can assure you, there's nothing here but wishful thinking and overactive imaginations." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but Thorne cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I think we've heard enough. Dr. Marsh, I suggest you return to your lab and focus on more grounded pursuits. Leave the wild speculations to the novelists and dreamers." With that, he strode from the room, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Evelyn stood frozen at the podium, her cheeks burning with shame and rage. But as the crowd began to disperse, muttering and shaking their heads, Dr. Chen approached the stage. She placed a hand on Evelyn's arm, her eyes shining with a fierce, determined light. "Don't listen to him," she said, her voice low and intense. "He's a dinosaur, stuck in his ways. But you're on to something, Dr. Marsh, something important, and I want to help you find it." Evelyn looked at the young woman, seeing the same hunger, the same desperate need for answers that burned within her own heart. And in that moment, she knew she had found an ally. Together, they would unravel this mystery. Together, they would find the truth, no matter where it might lead them. Even if it meant defying the skeptics, the naysayers, the whole damn scientific establishment. For the song was still calling, still echoing in the depths, and Evelyn knew she would not rest until she had followed it to its source, into the very heart of the abyss. Chapter 6. Crossing the Threshold. The lab was a flurry of activity, a controlled chaos of bubbling beakers and whirring machines. Evelyn moved through it all like a woman possessed, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity. In the weeks since the disastrous conference, she had thrown herself into her work with a renewed sense of purpose. Dr. Chen had been true to her word, providing both practical assistance and moral support. Together, they had pored over the data, refining their analyses, honing their hypotheses. And now, at last, they were ready. Ready to take the next step, to cross the threshold into the unknown. Evelyn stood before the glowing screens, her gaze drawn irresistibly to the pulsing lines of the spectrogram. The whale song had become a part of her now, a constant presence in her thoughts and dreams. She heard it even in the silence, a ghostly echo that seemed to call her onwards, ever deeper. "Are you sure about this?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice cutting through Evelyn's reverie. "It's a big risk. If something goes wrong..." Evelyn shook her head, a fierce smile on her lips. "I have to know," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "I have to see it for myself. I can't let this go." Chen nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "I understand, but promise me you'll be careful. Don't take any unnecessary risks." Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp bark that held little humor. "In our line of work, everything's a risk. But this is worth it. Whatever's waiting for us down there, it's going to change everything. I can feel it." She turned back to the screens, her fingers flying over the keys. A new window opened, a live feed from the research vessel that bobbed on the waves far above. The deck was a hive of activity, crew members scurrying to and fro as they prepared for the dive. Evelyn's heart raced as she watched them work, a thrill of anticipation coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to finally put her theories to the test. A chime sounded, and a voice crackled over the speakers. "Dr. Marsh, we're ready for you. The submersible is prepped and waiting." Evelyn took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she reached for the microphone. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Let's do this." She turned to Dr. Chen, a sudden lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "For everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Chen smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You would have found a way," she said, her voice warm with affection. "You're too stubborn to let anything stop you. but I'm glad I could be here to see it through with you." Evelyn nodded, a fierce grin spreading across her face. "When I get back," she said, her voice ringing with certainty, "we're going to have one hell of a story to tell." With that, she turned and strode from the lab, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Dr. Chen watched her go, a mix of pride and fear warring in her heart. For she knew, as surely as Evelyn did, that they were standing on the brink of something vast and terrifying. Something that might change the course of human history, might rewrite the very fabric of reality itself. And as the door swung shut behind Evelyn's retreating form, Dr. Chen could only pray that her friend would return unscathed, that the secrets of the deep would not claim her body and soul. For the abyss was waiting, and its hunger knew no bounds, and Evelyn, brave, brilliant Evelyn, was walking willingly into its jaws, chasing a mystery that might consume her utterly. But such was the price of knowledge, the cost of daring to cross the threshold into the unknown. And as Dr. Chen turned back to her work, she knew that she would have done the same had their positions been reversed. For the song was calling, and its siren call could not be denied. And whatever awaited them in the depths, they would face it together, united by a bond that transcended mere friendship, mere collegiality. They were explorers, pioneers, seekers of truth in a world of shadows. And though the path ahead was dark and full of peril, they would walk it gladly, knowing that the rewards that awaited them were beyond all imagining. And so, with a final glance at the silent screens, Dr. Chen returned to her labors, her heart full of hope and dread in equal measure. For the threshold had been crossed, and there could be no turning back now. The abyss beckoned, and Evelyn was ready to heed its call, come what may. Chapter 7. Aboard the Siren. The research vessel rose and fell with the swell of the waves, its steel hull gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Evelyn stood on the deck, the wind whipping her hair across her face as she gazed out over the endless expanse of blue. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, had imagined it in 1,000 different ways, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it, for the sheer visceral thrill of setting out into the unknown. Around her, the crew bustled to and fro, their faces tight with concentration as they went about their tasks. Evelyn had handpicked them herself, choosing only the best, the brightest, the most daring. They were a motley bunch, drawn from a dozen different fields. Marine biologists, geologists, engineers, even a few ex-military types. But they were united by a common purpose, a shared hunger for discovery. Evelyn made her way across the deck, the metal grating clanging beneath her boots. She nodded to the crew members as she passed, exchanging brief words of encouragement and camaraderie. She knew how much this meant to them, how much they had sacrificed to be here. But as she neared the stern, her steps faltered, for there, hunched over the railing, was a figure she had not expected to see. "Richard?" she said, her voice sharp with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Dr. Thorne turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't let you go alone," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Not after everything that's happened." Evelyn felt a sudden surge of anger, her fists clenching at her sides. "You made your position clear at the conference," she said, her voice cold and bitter. "You don't believe in my work. You think I'm chasing ghosts." Thorne shook his head, a rueful smile playing about his lips. "I was wrong," he said, his voice soft and heavy with regret. "I let my ego get in the way. I couldn't see what was right in front of me." Evelyn stared at him, her anger slowly ebbing away. "What changed your mind?" she asked, her voice wary and guarded. Thorne reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, battered notebook. "I found this in my office," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was my father's. He was a marine biologist too, back in the day." Evelyn took the notebook, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded and smudged, but the words were still legible, still clear and sharp. "He wrote about a sound," Thorne said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A sound he heard on a research trip, decades ago. A sound that haunted him for the rest of his life." Evelyn's heart raced as she scanned the pages, her eyes widening with each passing sentence. For there, in the cramped and spidery handwriting, was a description of a song that was achingly, terrifyingly familiar. "The same song," she breathed, her voice trembling with awe and fear. "The same one we've been hearing." Thorne nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He never found the source, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But he knew it was out there, waiting to be discovered. And now I know it too. Evelyn looked up at him, her heart swelling with a sudden fierce joy. Thank you, she said, her voice rough with gratitude, for believing in me, for being here. Thorne smiled, a small, crooked thing that transformed his face. I wouldn't miss it for the world, he said, his voice warm and sincere. Whatever's waiting for us down there, we'll face it together. Evelyn nodded, her eyes shining with determination. Together, she echoed, her voice ringing with conviction. And with that, they turned back to the sea, their gazes drawn irresistibly to the horizon. For somewhere out there beneath the waves, the answer was waiting. The answer to the song, to the mystery that had consumed them both. And they would find it, no matter the cost. For they were aboard the Siren now, and her call could not be denied. The abyss beckoned, and they were ready to heed its summons, to plunge headlong into the unknown. And though the path ahead was dark and full of peril, they would walk it gladly, hand in hand, united by a bond that transcended mere friendship, mere collegiality. They were explorers, pioneers, seekers of truth in a world of shadows. And whatever awaited them in the depths, they would face it together, come what may. For the song was calling, and its siren call could not be denied. And aboard the Siren, with the wind in their hair and the salt spray on their faces, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The journey had begun, and there could be no turning back now. The abyss beckoned, and they were ready to answer its call, to plunge headlong into the heart of the mystery. And so, with a final glance at the receding shore, Evelyn and Thorne turned their faces to the sea, their hearts full of hope and wonder and dread. For the unknown lay before them, vast and dark and full of secrets. And they would meet it head-on, unafraid and undaunted, ready to face whatever lay in store. For aboard the Siren, they were explorers, adventurers, seekers of truth. And the truth, they knew, was waiting for them in the depths, calling to them with a voice that could not be ignored. And they would find it, no matter the cost, no matter the peril. For the song was calling, and they were ready to answer, to follow it to the very ends of the earth and beyond. Chapter 8. The Abyss Calls Back. The submersible hung suspended in the inky blackness, a tiny island of light in a sea of endless dark. Evelyn sat hunched over the controls, her face bathed in the eerie glow of the instrument panel. Around her, the crew worked in tense silence, their eyes glued to the screens and readouts that were their only link to the world above. They had been descending for hours now, plunging deeper and deeper into the abyss, chasing the echo of the song that had brought them here. And now, at last, they were nearing the source. The sensors had begun to pick up a new signal, a pulsing, throbbing hum that seemed to fill the tiny craft with its resonance. It was a sound unlike anything Evelyn had ever heard before, a sound that made her bones ache and her teeth rattle in her skull. She leaned forward, her fingers tightening on the controls. "We're getting close," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "The signal is getting stronger." Beside her, Thorne nodded, his face drawn and pale in the ghostly light. "How deep are we?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn glanced at the depth gauge, her heart skipping a beat. 10,000 meters, she said, her voice hushed with awe. "We're in the Hadal zone now, deeper than anyone has ever gone before." The crew exchanged nervous glances, their faces etched with a mix of fear and exhilaration. They knew the risks, knew the dangers that lurked in the crushing depths, but they also knew the rewards that awaited them, the chance to be a part of something truly extraordinary. And so they pressed on, the submersible descending ever deeper into the abyss, the song growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was like nothing she had ever experienced before, a vibration that seemed to resonate in the very core of her being. It was as if the ocean itself were speaking to her, whispering secrets in a language she could almost, but not quite, understand. And then suddenly, the submersible shuddered, the metal groaning under the immense pressure of the depths. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. "What was that?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. The pilot, A grizzled veteran of countless deep-sea missions shook his head. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight with tension. "But we're picking up something on the sonar. Something big." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes widening as she stared at the screen. There, in the murky depths, a vast shape was taking form, a shadow that seemed to fill the entire ocean. "What is that?" Thorn breathed, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and dread. Evelyn shook her head, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It was like nothing she had ever encountered before, a creature so vast and ancient that it defied all understanding. And then, as if sensing their presence, the shape began to move, its massive bulk shifting in the darkness. The submersible rocked and swayed, buffeted by the currents that swirled around the creature's titanic form. Evelyn gripped the controls, her knuckles white with tension. She knew they should turn back, knew they were in over their heads, but something held her fast, a feeling deep in her gut that this was what she had been searching for all along, and so she pressed on, guiding the submersible closer and closer to the monstrous shape, the song growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. And then, just as they were about to make contact, the creature vanished, melting back into the darkness as if it had never been. Evelyn blinked, her mind reeling with confusion and disappointment. Had it all been a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the pressures of the deep? But before she could ponder the question further, the submersible shuddered again, the metal groaning under the strain, and then, to her horror, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a voice, a human voice, echoing through the depths, but it was not the voice of any of the crew, not the voice of anyone she recognized. It was her own voice, distorted and fragmented, drifting through the abyss like a ghostly whisper. "Help me," it said, the words repeating over and over, a desperate plea from the darkness. "Please help me." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of dread settling in the pit of her stomach. She turned to Thorn, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thorn nodded, his face ashen in the ghostly light. "It's not possible," he whispered, his voice filled with a mix of awe and terror. "It can't be." But even as he spoke, the voice came again, louder and more insistent than before, and this time, there was no mistaking it. It was Evelyn's voice, calling out from the depths, begging for help from the very abyss that had swallowed her whole. And as the crew stared at each other in mute horror, the true depths of the mystery began to unfold, a truth more terrifying and wondrous than any of them could have ever imagined. For the abyss had called back, and the song that had brought them here was not a song at all, but a summons from the very heart of the deep. And now, trapped in the crushing darkness, with no way out and no hope of escape, they could only listen in helpless awe as the voice of the abyss spoke to them, whispering secrets that no mortal mind was meant to know. For they had crossed the threshold into the unknown, and there could be no turning back now. The abyss had them in its grasp, and it would never let them go. And as the submersible drifted ever deeper into the darkness, Evelyn could only stare into the void, her mind reeling with the terrible knowledge of what lay ahead. For the song was calling, and the abyss was waiting, and the truth that awaited them was a truth that would shatter their world forever. And so, with a final desperate prayer, Evelyn closed her eyes and surrendered to the darkness, letting the song carry her into the heart of the mystery, into the very jaws of the deep. Chapter 9. Whispers of the Deep. The submersible drifted through the inky blackness, a tiny speck of light in a vast ocean of darkness. Inside, the crew huddled together, their faces pale and drawn in the eerie glow of the instrument panels. They had been trapped down here for days now, or maybe weeks. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in the crushing depths. The voice, Evelyn's voice, had been their constant companion, whispering to them from the void, taunting them with secrets they could not comprehend. And now, as they drifted aimlessly through the abyss, they could feel the weight of the ocean bearing down on them, the pressure of the depths threatening to crush them like an eggshell. Evelyn sat hunched in the corner, her eyes glazed and distant. She had barely spoken since the first appearance of the voice, retreating into herself, as if she were trying to block out the terrible knowledge that had been thrust upon her. Thorn watched her with growing concern, his heart aching for the woman he had come to care for more than he had ever thought possible. He knew she was strong, knew she had the courage and the will to face whatever lay ahead. But even the strongest spirit could be broken by the whispers of the deep. As he watched, Evelyn's lips began to move, her voice a barely audible whisper in the stillness of the sub. "It's calling to me," she said, her words slurred and distant. "The song. It's inside me now, a part of me. I can't escape it." Thorn leaned closer, his brow furrowed with worry. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice edged with desperation. "You have to fight it. You have to stay with us." But Evelyn only shook her head, a sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It's too late," she whispered. "I'm already gone." And then, before Thorn could respond, the voice came again, louder and more insistent than ever before. "Evelyn," it said, the words echoing through the sub like a thunderclap. "Come to me. Join me in the depths." Evelyn's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, Thorn thought he saw a flicker of recognition in their depths. But then it was gone, replaced by a blank, empty stare. "I'm coming," Evelyn said, her voice flat and lifeless. "I'm coming to join you." And with that, she began to move, her body jerking and twitching as if she were a puppet on a string. She stumbled towards the airlock, her fingers clawing at the controls. "Evelyn, no!" Thorn cried, lunging forward to stop her. But he was too late. With a hiss of escaping air, the airlock door swung open, and Evelyn stepped out into the crushing depths. Thorn watched in horror as she drifted away, her body swallowed up by the inky blackness. For a moment, he thought he saw her turn back towards him, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. And then she was gone, vanished into the abyss, leaving only the echo of her final words hanging in the stillness of the sub. "I'm coming," she had said. "I'm coming to join you." And as Thorn stared out into the darkness, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He knew that she had spoken the truth. For the abyss had claimed her, body and soul, and there could be no turning back now. The crew sat in stunned silence, their minds reeling with the horror of what they had just witnessed. And then, as if summoned by Evelyn's final words, a new sound filled the sub, a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of whale song, but not the song they had heard before. This was a different song, a darker song, a song that seemed to rise up from the very depths of the abyss. And as they listened, their hearts pounding in their chests, they heard something else, something that made their skin crawl with dread. It was the sound of laughter, a high, keening sound that seemed to echo through the sub like a banshee's wail. And then, to their horror, they realized where the laughter was coming from. It was coming from outside the sub, from the crushing depths of the abyss. It was coming from Evelyn. And as they stared out into the darkness, their minds reeling with the terrible knowledge of what lay ahead, they knew that they were lost, lost in the heart of the mystery, lost in the jaws of the deep. For the abyss had claimed one of their own, and it would not rest until it had claimed them all. And so, with a final desperate prayer, they huddled together in the darkness, waiting for the end to come, waiting for the abyss to take them, one by one, into its terrible embrace. Chapter 10. Into the Darkness. The submersible plunged deeper into the abyss, the pressure outside the hull increasing with every meter they descended. The crew sat in silence, their faces ashen, their eyes haunted by the memory of Evelyn's final moments. Thorn stared out into the darkness, his mind reeling with grief and horror. He had loved her, he realized now, with a fierce, desperate love that had consumed him from the moment they first met. And now she was gone, lost to the depths, lost to the terrible song that had called her home. But even as he mourned her, he knew that they could not afford to wallow in their sorrow. They had a mission to complete, a mystery to solve, and they would not rest until they had found the answers they sought. And so, with a heavy heart, he turned back to the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons and switches as he guided the sub ever deeper into the abyss. Around them, the darkness pressed in, a tangible presence that seemed to suck the very life from their bodies. The only light came from the bioluminescent creatures that drifted past the viewports, their eerie glow casting strange shadows on the walls of the sub. And then suddenly, they saw it. It rose up out of the darkness like a mountain, a vast towering shape that seemed to fill the entire ocean. It was a whale, but not like any whale they had ever seen before. It was colossal, its body stretching out into the darkness, its skin a mottled gray that seemed to absorb the light around it. And its eyes were like twin pools of darkness, bottomless and ancient, filled with a terrible alien intelligence. The crew stared in mute horror as the creature swam towards them, its massive bulk blocking out the faint light of the bioluminescent creatures. And then, to their astonishment, it began to sing. It was the same song they had heard before, the same eerie, haunting melody that had called to Evelyn from across the depths. But now, up close, it was different, more powerful, more insistent. It filled the sub like a physical presence, a vibration that seemed to resonate in their very bones. And as they listened, their minds began to warp and twist, their thoughts bending to the will of the creature before them. Thorn shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. He knew they were in danger, knew they had to escape before it was too late. But even as he reached for the controls, he felt a strange lethargy stealing over him, a numbness that seemed to seep into his very soul. And then, to his horror, he heard a voice he knew all too well. "Join us," it said, the words echoing through the sub like a siren's call. "Join us in the depths." It was Evelyn's voice, but not as he had ever heard it before. It was a voice that was no longer human, a voice that had been twisted and warped by the song of the whale. And as he listened, his mind reeling with dread, he knew that she was lost to him forever, lost to the terrible power of the creature that had claimed her. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, he felt a flicker of something else, something that burned bright and fierce in the depths of his soul. It was hope, a desperate, defiant hope that refused to be extinguished. And with that hope came a sudden, blinding clarity, a realization that hit him like a bolt of lightning. They had to destroy the creature, had to silence its song before it could claim any more innocent lives. And to do that, they would have to venture even deeper into the abyss, into the very heart of the darkness that had swallowed Evelyn whole. It was a suicide mission, he knew, a journey from which they might never return. But it was the only way, the only hope they had of stopping the creature before it was too late. And so, with a final desperate prayer, he turned to the crew, his voice ringing out in the stillness of the sub. "We have to go deeper," he said, his words heavy with the weight of their fate. "We have to find a way to destroy that thing before it destroys us all." The crew stared at him in stunned silence, their faces etched with fear and dread. But then, slowly, one by one, they nodded, their eyes hardening with a grim determination. They knew the risks, knew the danger that lay ahead, but they also knew that they had no choice, that they were the only ones who could stop the creature before it was too late. And so, with a final, desperate plea to whatever gods might be listening, they plunged deeper into the abyss, into the very heart of the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Chapter 11. Ghost in the Machine. The submersible shuddered and groaned as it sank ever deeper into the abyss, the pressure outside the hull increasing with every passing second. Inside, the crew huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the screens that were their only link to the world outside. And what they saw on those screens made their blood run cold. The sonar was a mass of impossible shadows, vast shapes that loomed out of the darkness like the ghosts of long-dead leviathans. They twisted and writhed in the murky depths, their forms shifting and changing in ways that defied all reason. At first, Thorn thought it was just a glitch, a malfunction caused by the crushing pressure of the depths. But as he stared at the screen, his eyes straining to make sense of the chaos, he began to realize the terrible truth. The shadows were real as the creature that had claimed Evelyn, as real as the song that still echoed through the sub like a siren's call. And they were coming for them. He turned to the pilot, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get us out of here," he said, his words clipped and tense. "Now." But the pilot only shook his head, his face a mask of dread. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the groaning of the hull. "The controls, they're not responding." Thorn stared at him in disbelief, his mind reeling with the implications of his words. And then, with a sudden sickening lurch, he understood. The creature, the whale, whatever it was controlling the sub, guiding them deeper into the abyss, into the very heart of the darkness that had swallowed Evelyn whole. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. He turned back to the screen, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the shadows converging on them, their massive forms blotting out the faint light of the sub's floodlights. And then, just as they were about to be engulfed, the screen went black, plunging them into a darkness so complete that it was like being buried alive. For a moment there was only silence, a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow them whole. And then, slowly, a new sound began to fill the sub, a sound that made their skin crawl with dread. It was the sound of whale song, but not like any whale song they had ever heard before. It was a twisted, distorted sound, a sound that seemed to rise up from the very depths of madness. And as they listened, their minds reeling with horror, they began to hear something else, something that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of voices, human voices, twisted and warped beyond all recognition. They were the voices of the dead, the voices of all those who had been claimed by the abyss, all those who had been lost to the terrible song of the whale. And among those voices, rising above the rest like a scream of anguish, was the voice of Evelyn. "Join us," she whispered, her words echoing through the sub like a curse. "Join us in the depths." Thorn felt a wave of despair wash over him, a hopelessness so profound that it threatened to crush him like a bug. He knew that they were lost, that there was no escape from the terrible fate that awaited them. But even as he resigned himself to his doom, he felt a flicker of something else, something that burned bright and fierce in the depths of his soul. It was anger, a white-hot rage that seared through him like a flame. And with that anger came a sudden blinding clarity, a realization that hit him like a bolt of lightning. They had to fight, had to resist the siren call of the abyss with every ounce of strength they possessed. They had to find a way to break free of the creature's control, to silence its song before it could claim any more innocent lives. And so, with a roar of defiance, he lunged for the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons and switches as he fought to wrest control of the sub from the creature that held them in its grasp. Around him, the crew sprang into action, their faces set with grim determination as they worked to repair the damage that had been done. They knew that they were fighting a losing battle, that the odds were stacked against them in every way imaginable. But they also knew that they had no choice, that they were the only ones who could stop the creature before it was too late. And so, with a final desperate prayer, they threw themselves into the fray, their hearts pounding with a fierce, defiant hope as they struggled to break free of the abyss that threatened to swallow them whole. But even as they fought, the shadows outside the sub continued to writhe and twist, their massive forms pressing in on them from every side. And the song, the terrible, maddening song, only grew louder and more insistent with every passing second. Thorn gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out, a way to escape the terrible fate that awaited them. But everywhere he looked, he saw only darkness, only the yawning void of the abyss that had claimed Evelyn and so many others. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, he saw it. It was a faint glimmer of light, a tiny pinprick in the darkness that seemed to beckon to him like a beacon. And as he stared at it, his heart pounding with a sudden desperate hope, he knew what he had to do. He had to follow that light, had to guide the sub towards it with every ounce of skill and determination he possessed. He didn't know what lay beyond it, didn't know if it was a way out or just another trap set by the creature that hunted them. But he knew that it was their only chance, their only hope of escape from the nightmare that had engulfed them. And so, with a final desperate cry, he wrenched the controls to the side, sending the sub hurtling towards the faint glimmer of light that shone like a beacon in the darkness. Around him, the crew held their breath, their eyes fixed on the screens as they watched the sub plunge deeper and deeper into the unknown. And then, with a sudden blinding flash, they burst through the darkness and into a world of light and color and sound. They had escaped the abyss, had broken free of the creature's grasp. But even as they rejoiced, even as they wept with relief and gratitude, they knew that their ordeal was far from over. For the abyss still called to them, its song echoing in their minds like a haunting melody. And they knew that they would never be truly free of it, that the memory of what they had seen and heard would stay with them forever. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. And as they set a course for home, their hearts heavy with the weight of all they had lost, they knew that they would never forget the sacrifice that Evelyn had made, the courage that she had shown in the face of the unknown. for she had given her life to save them, had plunged into the depths to silence the song that threatened to destroy them all. And though they mourned her loss, though they wept for the woman they had known and loved, they knew that her spirit would live on, a shining light in the darkness that would guide them through the trials that lay ahead. And so, with heavy hearts and a fierce, unshakable resolve, they sailed on into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. For they were the survivors of the abyss, the ones who had looked into the face of madness and lived to tell the tale. And nothing, not even the memory of the horrors they had witnessed, could ever take that away from them. Chapter 12. The Climax of the Deep. The submersible burst through the surface of the water like a cork from a bottle, the sudden rush of light and air hitting them like a physical blow. For a moment they could only sit there, blinking in the blinding sun, their minds reeling with the enormity of what they had just experienced. And then slowly, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were alone, adrift in the middle of the ocean, with no way to contact the outside world. Their submersible was badly damaged, its systems barely functional, its hull battered and scarred by the crushing pressure of the depths. And worst of all, they had lost Evelyn, the woman who had been the heart and soul of their expedition, the one who had led them into the abyss and paid the ultimate price for her courage. Thorn stared out at the endless expanse of blue, his heart heavy with grief and guilt. He had been the one who had pushed her to go deeper, had urged her to follow the song that had called to her from the depths. And now, she was gone, lost to the abyss that had claimed her, her final moments a mystery that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But even as he mourned her loss, even as he wept for the woman he had loved, he knew that they could not afford to wallow in their sorrow. They had to find a way to survive, had to signal for help before their air and supplies ran out. And so, with a heavy heart, he turned to the crew, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke. "We have to send out a distress call," he said, his words heavy with the weight of their situation. "We have to let someone know where we are. What happened to us?" The crew nodded, their faces grim with determination as they set to work, their hands flying over the controls as they tried to coax some life back into the damaged systems. But even as they worked, even as they fought to keep the submersible afloat, they knew that their chances of survival were slim at best. They were too far from shore, too deep in the uncharted waters of the abyss. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, they heard it. It was a sound that made their blood run cold, a sound that echoed through the submersible like a death knell. It was the sound of whale song, the same eerie, haunting melody that had called to them from the depths, the same song that had claimed Evelyn and so many others. And it was coming from beneath them, rising up from the abyss like a siren's call. Thorn felt a wave of dread wash over him, a sickening certainty that they were not out of danger yet, that the creature that had hunted them in the depths was not done with them yet. And then, with a sudden, horrifying lurch, the submersible began to sink, dragged down by an unseen force that seemed to pull them back into the abyss they had just escaped. Around him, the crew cried out in terror, their faces twisted with fear as they clutched at the controls, desperate to break free of the creature's grasp. But it was no use. The submersible was sinking, plunging deeper and deeper into the darkness, the pressure outside the hull increasing with every passing second. And then, just as they were about to be crushed by the weight of the abyss, they saw it. It was the whale, the colossal creature that had haunted their dreams and stolen Evelyn away. It loomed out of the darkness like a mountain, its massive form blocking out the faint light of the submersible's floodlights. And in its eye, glinting in the darkness like a star, was Evelyn. She was there, trapped within the creature's massive bulk, her body fused with its flesh in a way that defied all reason. And as they stared at her, their minds reeling with horror, they heard her voice, echoing through the submersible like a curse. "You cannot escape," she whispered, her words twisted and distorted by the song of the whale. "You belong to the abyss now, just as I do." Thorn felt a surge of rage and despair wash over him, a hopelessness so profound that it threatened to crush him like a bug. He knew that they were lost, that there was no escape from the terrible fate that awaited them. But even as he resigned himself to his doom, he felt a flicker of something else, something that burned bright and fierce in the depths of his soul. It was love, a love so powerful and all-consuming that it eclipsed everything else. And with that love came a sudden, blinding clarity, a realization that hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had to save her, had to find a way to free Evelyn from the creature's grasp, to silence its song and break its hold over her once and for all. And so, with a roar of defiance, he lunged for the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons and switches as he fought to wrest control of the submersible from the creature that held them in its grasp. Around him, the crew sprang into action, their faces set with grim determination as they worked to repair the damage that had been done. They knew that they were fighting a losing battle, that the odds were stacked against them in every way imaginable. But they also knew that they had no choice, that they were the only ones who could save Evelyn, who could stop the creature before it was too late. And so, with a final, desperate prayer, they threw themselves into the fray, their hearts pounding with a fierce, defiant hope as they struggled to break free of the abyss that threatened to swallow them whole. But even as they fought, even as they poured every ounce of their strength and courage into the battle, they knew that they were running out of time. The submersible was sinking faster now, the pressure outside the hull increasing with every passing second. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, Thorne saw it. It was a weakness in the creature's flesh, a tiny flaw in its massive bulk that glowed like a beacon in the darkness. And as he stared at it, his mind racing with a sudden, desperate plan, he knew what he had to do. He had to strike at that weakness, had to drive the submersible's drill into the heart of the creature and silence its song once and for all. It was a suicide mission, he knew, a final, desperate gamble that would almost certainly cost him his life. But he also knew that it was the only way, the only hope they had of saving Evelyn and escaping the abyss that threatened to claim them all. And so, with a final, anguished look at the woman he loved, he wrenched the controls to the side, sending the submersible hurtling towards the creature's massive bulk. The impact was devastating, a shattering blow that sent shockwaves rippling through the submersible's hull. But even as they felt the metal buckling and twisting around them, even as they heard the roar of rushing water and the screams of the dying, they knew that they had struck true. The creature convulsed and thrashed, its massive form shuddering with agony as the drill tore through its flesh. And then, with a final ear-splitting shriek, it went still, its song silenced forever by the courage and sacrifice of those who had dared to challenge it. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed, Thorne could only stare at the place where Evelyn had been, his heart breaking with the knowledge that he had lost her forever. But even as he wept, even as he mourned the woman he had loved, he knew that she was free now, that the abyss no longer held any power over her. And as he felt the submersible rising to the surface, borne up by the rush of escaping air, he knew that they had won, that they had triumphed over the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. But even as they broke through the surface, even as they felt the sun on their faces and the wind in their hair, they knew that their ordeal was far from over. For the abyss still called to them, its memory etched into their minds like a scar, and they knew that they would never be truly free of it, that the horrors they had witnessed would stay with them forever. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. And as they set a course for home, their hearts heavy with the weight of all they had lost, they knew that they would never forget the sacrifice that Evelyn had made, the love that had given them the strength to survive the impossible. And so, with heavy hearts and unbreakable spirits, they sailed on into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. For they were the survivors of the abyss, the ones who had stared into the face of madness and lived to tell the tale. And nothing, not even the memory of the horrors they had endured, could ever take that away from them. Chapter 13. The Surface Shattered. The sun beat down on the deck of the research vessel, its harsh, unforgiving light a stark contrast to the darkness of the abyss below. On the bridge, the crew hunched over their instruments, their faces drawn and haggard, their eyes haunted by the memories of what they had seen. It had been hours since they had surfaced, since they had sent out their desperate plea for help, but so far there had been no response, no sign that anyone had heard their call. They were alone, adrift in the middle of the ocean, with no way to contact the outside world. And worst of all, they were broken, shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. by the losses they had suffered. Thorn sat in the corner of the bridge, his head in his hands, his mind reeling with the enormity of what had happened. He had lost Evelyn, the woman he had loved, the one who had been the heart and soul of their expedition. And he had lost himself, too. Lost the man he had once been, the man who had believed in the power of science and reason to unlock the secrets of the universe. Now, he was a shell of that man, a broken, hollow thing that had seen the face of madness and survived, but at a cost he could barely comprehend. Around him, the crew worked in silence, their hands shaking as they tried to repair the damage that had been done, to coax some life back into the battered systems of the research vessel. But even as they worked, even as they fought to keep the ship afloat, they knew that it was a losing battle. They were too far from shore, too deep in the uncharted waters of the abyss. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, they heard it. It was a sound that made their blood run cold, a sound that echoed across the waves like a death knell. It was the sound of Evelyn's voice, twisted and distorted, rising up from the depths like a siren's call. "You cannot escape," she whispered, her words carried on the wind like a curse. "You belong to the abyss now, just as I do." Thorn felt a wave of dread wash over him, a sickening certainty that they were not out of danger yet, that the creature that had hunted them in the depths was not done with them yet. And then, with a sudden horrifying lurch, the research vessel began to sink, dragged down by an unseen force that seemed to pull them back into the abyss they had just escaped. Around him, the crew cried out in terror, their faces twisted with fear as they clutched at the controls, desperate to break free of the creature's grasp. But it was no use. The ship was sinking, plunging deeper and deeper into the darkness, the pressure outside the hull increasing with every passing second. And then, just as they were about to be crushed by the weight of the abyss, they saw it. It was the whale, the colossal creature that had haunted their dreams and stolen Evelyn away. It loomed out of the darkness like a mountain, its massive form blocking out the faint light of the ship's floodlights. And in its eye, glinting in the darkness like a star, was Evelyn. She was there, trapped within the creature's massive bulk, her body fused with its flesh in a way that defied all reason. And as they stared at her, their minds reeling with horror, they heard her voice, echoing through the ship like a curse. "Join me," she whispered, her words twisted and distorted by the song of the whale. "Join me in the depths, where we can be together forever." Thorn felt a surge of rage and despair wash over him, a hopelessness so profound that it threatened to crush him like a bug. He knew that they were lost, that there was no escape from the terrible fate that awaited them. But even as he resigned himself to his doom, he felt a flicker of something else, something that burned bright and fierce in the depths of his soul. It was love, a love so powerful and all-consuming that it eclipsed everything else. And with that love came a sudden, blinding clarity, a realization that hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had to save her, had to find a way to free Evelyn from the creature's grasp, to silence its song and break its hold over her once and for all. And so, with a roar of defiance, he lunged for the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons and switches as he fought to wrest control of the ship from the creature that held them in its grasp. Around him, the crew sprang into action, their faces set with grim determination as they worked to repair the damage that had been done. They knew that they were fighting a losing battle, that the odds were stacked against them in every way imaginable. But they also knew that they had no choice, that they were the only ones who could save Evelyn, who could stop the creature before it was too late. And so, with a final desperate prayer, they threw themselves into the fray, their hearts pounding with a fierce, defiant hope as they struggled to break free of the abyss that threatened to swallow them whole. But even as they fought, even as they poured every ounce of their strength and courage into the battle, they knew that they were running out of time. The ship was sinking faster now, the pressure outside the hull increasing with every passing second. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, Thorn saw it. It was a weakness in the creature's flesh, a tiny flaw in its massive bulk that glowed like a beacon in the darkness. And as he stared at it, his mind racing with a sudden desperate plan, he knew what he had to do. He had to strike at that weakness, had to drive the ship's drill into the heart of the creature, and silence its song once and for all. It was a suicide mission, he knew, a final desperate gamble that would almost certainly cost him his life. But he also knew that it was the only way, the only hope they had of saving Evelyn and escaping the abyss that threatened to claim them all. And so, with a final, anguished look at the woman he loved, he wrenched the controls to the side, sending the ship hurtling towards the creature's massive bulk. The impact was devastating, a shattering blow that sent shock waves rippling through the ship's hull. But even as they felt the metal buckling and twisting around them, even as they heard the roar of rushing water and the screams of the dying, they knew that they had struck true. The creature convulsed and thrashed, its massive form shuddering with agony as the drill tore through its flesh. And then with a final, ear-splitting shriek, it went still, its song silenced forever by the courage and sacrifice of those who had dared to challenge it. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed, Thorn could only stare at the place where Evelyn had been, his heart breaking with the knowledge that he had lost her forever. But even as he wept, even as he mourned the woman he had loved, he knew that she was free now, that the abyss no longer held any power over her. And as he felt the ship rising to the surface, borne up by the rush of escaping air, he knew that they had won, that they had triumphed over the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. But even as they broke through the surface, even as they felt the sun on their faces and the wind in their hair, they knew that their ordeal was far from over. For the abyss still called to them, its memory etched into their minds like a scar. And they knew that they would never be truly free of it, that the horrors they had witnessed would stay with them forever. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. And as they set a course for home, their hearts heavy with the weight of all they had lost, they knew that they would never forget the sacrifice that Evelyn had made, the love that had given them the strength to survive the impossible. And so, with heavy hearts and unbreakable spirits, they sailed on into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. For they were the survivors of the abyss, the ones who had stared into the face of madness and lived to tell the tale. And nothing, not even the memory of the horrors they had endured, could ever take that away from them. Chapter 14. The Ritual. The days that followed were a blur of activity and confusion, a whirlwind of debriefings and interviews, of medical exams and psychological evaluations. The survivors of the abyss were poked and prodded, their every word and action scrutinized for signs of madness or deception. But through it all, Thorn remained silent, his eyes distant and haunted, his mind lost in the memories of what he had seen and done. He had lost Evelyn, the woman he had loved, the one who had been the heart and soul of their expedition. And he had lost himself too, lost the man he had once been, the man who had believed in the power of science and reason to unlock the secrets of the universe. Now, he was a shell of that man, a broken, hollow thing that had seen the face of madness and survived, but at a cost he could barely comprehend. And yet, even in the depths of his despair, he could not shake the feeling that there was something he had missed, some clue or hint that could help him make sense of the horrors he had witnessed. And so, in the dead of night, when the others were asleep and the ship was silent, he began to search. He pored over the ship's logs and records, his eyes straining to make out the faded handwritten notes that Evelyn had left behind. He studied the strange artifacts they had recovered from the abyss, the twisted, otherworldly relics that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unsettling energy. And as he searched, as he dug deeper and deeper into the mystery that had consumed them all, he began to see patterns emerging, connections that he had never noticed before. There were references to ancient myths and legends, to forgotten civilizations that had worshipped strange eldritch gods in the depths of the ocean. There were hints of dark rituals and sacrifices, of blood offerings made to appease the hunger of the abyss. And there, hidden among the pages of a crumbling ancient tome, he found it. It was a ritual, a dark and terrible rite that promised to unlock the secrets of the deep, to grant the power to commune with the creatures that dwelled in the abyss. Thorn stared at the page, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had found. He knew that it was madness, that the ritual was nothing more than a trap, a lure set by the creature that had claimed Evelyn and so many others. But even as he tried to resist, even as he fought against the siren call of the abyss, he could feel its pull, the dark and terrible longing that had taken root in his soul. And so, with trembling hands and a heart full of dread, He began to gather the things he would need, the strange and ancient artifacts that the ritual demanded. He worked in secret, his movements furtive and quick, his eyes darting nervously from side to side as he stole through the ship's corridors. He knew that the others would try to stop him, that they would see the madness in his eyes and know that he had been lost to the abyss. But he could not let that happen, could not let them stand in the way of his destiny. And so, on a dark and moonless night, when the ship was silent and the crew was lost in dreams, he made his way to the deck, his arms laden with the tools of his dark trade. He stood at the railing, his eyes fixed on the inky blackness of the ocean below, his mind filled with the whispering voices of the deep. And then, with a final, desperate prayer to whatever gods might be listening, he began the ritual. He chanted the ancient words, his voice rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic cadence. He lit the candles and burned the incense, the acrid smoke curling around him like a living thing. And as he worked, as he poured his heart and soul into the dark and terrible rite, he could feel the power building within him, the dark and ancient energy that flowed through his veins like molten fire. And then, just as the ritual reached its climax, just as he felt the barriers between worlds beginning to crumble and fall, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, of someone approaching from behind, their movement slow and deliberate, their breath heavy with the weight of dread. And as he turned, as he stared into the face of the one who had interrupted his dark work, he saw the horror in their eyes, the sickening realization of what he had done. For there, standing before him, was Dr. Thorne, his mentor and friend, the one who had tried to warn him of the dangers that lay ahead. And in that moment, as he stared into the face of the man who had been like a father to him, Thorne knew that he had crossed a line, that he had ventured into territory from which there could be no return. For he had invoked the power of the abyss, had called upon the dark and terrible forces that dwelled in the depths of the ocean. And now, as he felt the darkness rising within him, as he heard the whispering voices of the deep calling out to him, he knew that there could be no turning back, no escape from the fate he had chosen. For he had become one with the abyss, a creature of the deep, a servant of the dark and terrible gods that ruled the ocean's depths. And as he turned to face the horrified figure of Dr. Thorne, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For he had unleashed the power of the abyss, and now there could be no turning back, no escape from the darkness that had claimed his soul. Chapter 15. The watcher Dr. Thorne stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the figure before him. It was Evelyn, but not the Evelyn he had known, not the brilliant, passionate woman who had been the heart and soul of their expedition. No, this was a different creature entirely, a thing of darkness and shadow, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, its flesh twisted and warped by the power of the abyss. And yet, even as he recoiled in fear and revulsion, he could not help but feel a flicker of recognition, a sense that somewhere, deep within that monstrous form, the woman he had loved still lived. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What have you done?" The creature that had once been Evelyn tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as it studied him with a cold, predatory gaze. "I have become what I was meant to be," it said, its voice a sibilant hiss that made Thorne's skin crawl. "I have embraced the power of the abyss, the dark and terrible forces that dwell in the depths of the ocean." Thorne shook his head, his mind reeling with the horror of what he was hearing. "This isn't you," he said, his voice trembling with desperation. "This isn't the Evelyn I know. You have to fight it, have to resist the pull of the abyss." But the creature only laughed, a cold mocking sound that echoed across the deck like the tolling of a funeral bell. "You fool," it said, its voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can save me, that you can bring me back from the brink of madness. But you cannot comprehend the power that flows through me now, the dark and ancient energy that has claimed my soul." And with that it began to change, its form shifting and warping before Thorne's horrified gaze. Its flesh rippled and bulged, its bones cracking and reforming as it took on a new monstrous shape. And as Thorne watched, as he stared in mute horror at the thing that had once been the woman he loved, he knew that he was lost, that there could be no escape from the fate that awaited him. For the creature before him was no longer human, no longer bound by the laws of nature or reason. It was a thing of the abyss, a creature of darkness and shadow, its very existence a violation of all that was good and right in the world. And yet, even as he felt the icy fingers of despair closing around his heart, he could not help but feel a flicker of hope, a sense that somewhere, deep within that monstrous form, the woman he had loved still lived. And so, with a final, desperate prayer to whatever gods might be listening, he stepped forward, his hand outstretched, his eyes fixed on the glowing, otherworldly orbs that had once been Evelyn's eyes. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Please come back to me. I love you, Evelyn. I always have, and I always will." For a moment the creature hesitated, its eyes flickering with something that might have been recognition, might have been the last fading embers of humanity. But then, with a sudden, terrible roar, it lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air, its jaws snapping with a hungry, feral fury. Thorn stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as he dodged and weaved, his mind racing as he tried to find a way to reach the woman he loved, to bring her back from the brink of madness. But it was no use. The creature was too strong, too fast, its every move a blur of speed and power that left him reeling and gasping for breath. And as he felt the icy touch of its claws against his skin, as he heard the sickening crunch of bone and the hot, coppery taste of blood in his mouth, he knew that he had failed, that he had lost the woman he loved forever. And yet, even as he felt the darkness closing in around him, even as he felt the icy fingers of death clutching at his heart, he could not help but feel a flicker of peace, a sense that somehow, in some strange and terrible way, he had done the right thing. For he had tried to save her, had tried to bring her back from the abyss that had claimed her soul. And though he had failed, though he had lost her forever, he knew that he had done all that he could, that he had loved her with every fiber of his being. And so, with a final, shuddering breath, he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, his mind filled with the image of the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost to the abyss. And as he felt the last fading embers of life slipping away, he knew that he would never forget her, that he would carry her with him always, a shining light in the darkness of his soul. For she had been his everything, his reason for living, his guiding star in the black and empty void of space. And though she was gone now, though she had been lost to the abyss that had claimed them all, he knew that she would live on in his heart, a memory of love and loss, of hope and despair, of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that had defined his life. And so, with a final silent prayer, he surrendered himself to the void, his mind filled with the image of the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, the woman who had been his everything. And in that moment, as the darkness claimed him at last, he knew that he was home, that he was where he belonged, in the arms of the abyss that had claimed them all. Chapter 16. Fractured Realities. Evelyn stared at the twisted, writhing mass of flesh and bone that had once been Dr. Thorne, her mind reeling with horror and revulsion. She had done this, had unleashed the power of the abyss upon the man she had loved, the man who had been her mentor and friend. And now, as she watched him struggle and scream, his body warping and changing before her eyes, she knew that there could be no turning back, no escape from the fate she had chosen. For she had become one with the abyss, a creature of darkness and shadow, its power flowing through her veins like molten fire. And though a part of her recoiled in horror at what she had become, another part reveled in it, exulting in the dark and terrible strength that now coursed through her body. She turned away from the monstrous thing that had once been Dr. Thorne, her eyes scanning the deck of the ship, taking in the familiar surroundings with a new alien gaze. Everything seemed different now, the once solid reality of the ship and its crew, now nothing more than a flimsy, insubstantial veil, a thin and fragile barrier between the world she had known and the dark, unfathomable realms that lay beyond. She could see the abyss now, could feel its presence all around her, a vast and terrible emptiness that yawned beneath the surface of the world, threatening to swallow everything in its path. And she could hear the voice of the abyss, the whispering, seductive call that had drawn her down into the depths, the siren song that had claimed her soul and made her one with the darkness. It was a voice that spoke of power and knowledge, of secrets long forgotten and truths too terrible to comprehend. It promised her everything she had ever wanted, everything she had ever dreamed of. if only she would surrender herself completely to its embrace. And as she listened to that voice, as she felt its dark and terrible power surging through her veins, she knew that she could never go back, that she could never be the woman she had once been. For she had seen the truth of the universe, had gazed into the heart of the abyss, and seen the dark and terrible forces that lurked there, waiting to be unleashed upon the world. And now, as she stood upon the deck of the ship, her mind fractured and reeling, she knew that she had a choice to make, a decision that would determine the fate of everything she had ever known and loved. She could resist the call of the abyss, could fight against the dark and terrible power that had claimed her soul. She could try to cling to the remnants of her humanity, to the memories of the woman she had once been and the life she had once lived. Or she could embrace the darkness completely, could surrender herself to the abyss and become one with the terrible forces that dwelled there, a creature of shadow and nightmare, a herald of the coming apocalypse. For a moment she hesitated, her mind torn between the two paths that lay before her. But then, with a sudden terrible certainty, she knew what she had to do. She had to let go, had to release the last fading embers of her humanity and give herself over to the abyss completely. For only then could she truly understand the power that flowed through her veins. Only then could she unlock the secrets of the universe and see the truth of all things. And so, with a final, shuddering breath, she closed her eyes and let the darkness take her mind filled with the whispering voices of the deep, the siren song of the abyss that had claimed her soul. And as she felt the last fading embers of her humanity slipping away, she knew that she had made the right choice, that she had embraced her true destiny and become one with the terrible forces that lurked in the depths of the ocean. For she was no longer Evelyn, no longer the woman she had once been. She was something else now, something dark and terrible and beautiful, a creature of the abyss, a herald of the coming darkness. And as she opened her eyes, as she gazed out upon the world with her new alien sight, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again, that the universe itself had been forever changed by the dark and terrible power that now flowed through her veins. For she had become the abyss, and the abyss had become her, and together they would remake the world in their own dark and terrible image, a realm of shadow and nightmare, a place where the dead walked and the living screamed in endless torment. And as she stepped forward, her mind filled with the whispering voices of the deep, she knew that her journey had only just begun, that the true horror of the abyss was yet to be unleashed upon the world. But she was ready to embrace her destiny and become the monster she had always been meant to be, ready to drown the world in darkness and claim it for her own. For she was the abyss, and the abyss was her, and together they would reign supreme, forever and always, in the dark and terrible depths of the ocean. Chapter 17. One Voice, Two Hearts. The days that followed were a blur of madness and horror, a nightmarish descent into the very heart of the abyss. Evelyn moved through the ship like a ghost, her mind fractured and reeling, her body racked with the dark and terrible power that now flowed through her veins. She could feel the presence of the abyss all around her, could hear its whispering voices in the darkest corners of her mind. It called to her, promising her power and knowledge, whispering secrets that no mortal mind was meant to know. And as she listened to those voices, as she felt the dark and terrible power surging through her body, she knew that she was losing herself, that the woman she had once been was slipping away, replaced by something else, something dark and monstrous and utterly inhuman. But even as she felt herself slipping away, even as she felt the last fading embers of her humanity being swallowed up by the darkness, she knew that she had to hold on, that she had to find a way to resist the call of the abyss and cling to the remnants of her sanity. And so, in a moment of desperate clarity, she made her way to the ship's lab, her mind racing with a sudden terrible plan. She would record her thoughts, would pour out her heart and soul into the ship's audio logs, leaving a final testament to the woman she had once been and the dark and terrible fate that had claimed her. And as she sat before the microphone, her voice trembling with emotion, she began to speak, her words spilling out in a torrential flood of anguish and despair. She spoke of the abyss, of the dark and terrible power that had claimed her soul and twisted her mind. She spoke of the creature that had once been Dr. Thorne, of the monstrous thing she had unleashed upon the world in a moment of weakness and despair. and she spoke of herself, of the woman she had once been, and the dark and terrible fate that had claimed her, of the voice that now whispered in her mind, the voice of the abyss that had become her own. "I am lost," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, "lost in the darkness, lost in the abyss that has claimed my soul. But even now, even as I feel myself slipping away, I know that I must hold on, that I must find a way to resist the call of the darkness and cling to the light." And then, with a sudden terrible clarity, she knew what she had to do. She had to go back, had to return to the place where it had all begun, to the deep and terrible depths of the ocean, where the abyss had first claimed her soul. For only there, in the heart of the darkness, could she find the answers she sought, the key to unlocking the terrible power that now flowed through her veins and breaking free of the abyss that had claimed her. And so, with a final desperate prayer, she ended her recording and rose to her feet, her mind filled with a grim and terrible purpose. She would go back to the abyss, would plunge once more into the dark and terrible depths of the ocean, and there, in the heart of the darkness, she would find the truth, the terrible secret that had been hidden from her for so long. For she was no longer Evelyn, no longer the woman she had once been. She was something else now, something dark and terrible and utterly inhuman, a creature of the abyss, a herald of the coming darkness. And as she made her way to the ship's deck, her mind filled with the whispering voices of the deep, she knew that her journey had only just begun, that the true horror of the abyss was yet to be unleashed upon the world. But she was ready, ready to embrace her destiny and become the monster she had always been meant to be, ready to drown the world in darkness and claim it for her own. For she was the abyss, and the abyss was her, and together they would reign supreme, forever and always, in the dark and terrible depths of the ocean. Chapter 18. The Vanishing. The ship was silent, the only sound the soft lapping of the waves against the hull. Evelyn stood on the deck, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her mind filled with a grim and terrible purpose. She had made her decision, had chosen to embrace the darkness that had claimed her soul and become one with the abyss that had swallowed her whole. And now, as she prepared to take the final step, to plunge once more into the dark and terrible depths of the ocean, she knew that there could be no turning back. Behind her, the crew of the ship watched in silent horror, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. They had seen the change in her, had watched as the woman they had known and loved had been consumed by the darkness, transformed into something monstrous and inhuman. And now, as they watched her step to the edge of the deck, her body poised to leap into the churning waters below, they knew that they were witnessing the end, the final act in a tragedy that had begun the moment they had first set foot in the abyss. Evelyn turned to face them, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, her face twisted into a terrible, inhuman smile. "Do not try to follow me," she said, her voice a sibilant hiss that made their skin crawl. "For the abyss claims its own, and none who enter its embrace shall ever return." And with that she leaped, her body arcing through the air, her arms outstretched as if to embrace the darkness that awaited her. For a moment, the crew could only stare in mute horror, their minds reeling with the enormity of what they had just witnessed. And then, as if released from a spell, they rushed to the edge of the deck, their eyes straining to catch a glimpse of Evelyn's form in the churning waters below. But there was nothing, no sign of the woman who had leaped to her doom, no trace of the dark and terrible creature she had become. She was gone, vanished into the depths of the abyss, swallowed up by the darkness that had claimed her soul. And as the crew stood there, their hearts heavy with grief and despair, they knew that they would never see her again, that the woman they had known and loved was lost to them forever, consumed by the terrible power of the abyss. But even as they mourned her loss, even as they wept for the woman who had been taken from them, they knew that they could not linger, that they had to press on, to find a way to escape the nightmare that had claimed them all. And so, with heavy hearts and trembling hands, they turned away from the churning waters and made their way back to the ship, their minds filled with a grim and terrible purpose. They would find a way to survive, to escape the dark and terrible fate that had claimed Evelyn and threatened to swallow them all. They would fight against the abyss with every ounce of strength and courage they possessed, would cling to the light, even as the darkness closed in around them. And though they knew that the road ahead would be long and treacherous, though they knew that they might never escape the nightmare that had claimed them, they would not give up, would not surrender to the abyss that lurked beneath the waves. For they were the last of the human race, the only ones who could stand against the darkness and the monsters it had spawned. And though they might fall, though they might be swallowed up by the abyss and the terrible creatures that dwelled within it, they would not go quietly into the night. They would fight, would rage against the dying of the light, would stand tall and proud in the face of the darkness that threatened to consume them all. And in the end, though they might be lost, though they might be claimed by the abyss and the terrible power that lurked within it, they would not be forgotten, would not be consigned to oblivion and despair. For they were the survivors of the abyss, the ones who had looked into the face of madness and lived to tell the tale. And though the world might never know their story, though the truth of what had happened might be lost to the ages, they would live on in memory and legend, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human race. And so, with a final, desperate prayer, they turned their faces to the horizon and set out into the unknown, ready to face whatever horrors the abyss might unleash upon them, ready to fight and die for the chance to see the sun rise one last time. Chapter 19. The Echo. The world was in chaos, the streets filled with panic and despair. In the days since the disappearance of the research vessel, rumors had spread like wildfire, tales of monsters and madness, of dark and terrible creatures that lurked beneath the waves. Governments had fallen, societies had collapsed, and the remnants of humanity had been left to fend for themselves in a world gone mad. But even amidst the chaos and the darkness, there were those who clung to hope, who refused to give in to the despair that threatened to swallow them whole. And among them was a man named Dr. Marcus Vale, a brilliant scientist who had devoted his life to the study of the strange and the unknown. For years, he had been fascinated by the tales of the abyss, by the rumors of dark and terrible creatures that lurked in the depths of the ocean. And now, as the world crumbled around him, he knew that he had to act, that he had to find a way to unravel the mystery that had claimed so many lives. And so, with a small team of fellow scientists and adventurers, he set out to find the lost research vessel, to recover the precious data and recordings that might hold the key to understanding the horror that had been unleashed upon the world. It was a desperate gamble, a mission that many would have called suicidal. But Dr. Vale was determined, driven by a burning need to know the truth, to uncover the secrets that had been hidden for so long. And as he and his team made their way across the vast and empty oceans, following the faint and flickering signal of the research vessel's distress beacon, they knew that they were risking everything, that they might never return from the dark and terrible depths that awaited them. But still they pressed on, driven by a fierce and unshakable resolve, a determination to see their mission through to the end, no matter the cost. And when at last they found the vessel, when they boarded its silent and lifeless decks and made their way through its darkened corridors, they knew that they had crossed a threshold, that they had entered a realm beyond the bounds of human understanding. The ship was a tomb, a silent and lifeless hulk that bore the scars of some terrible struggle. And as they made their way through its twisted and ruined chambers, they found the remnants of the crew, the broken and shattered bodies of those who had given their lives in the fight against the abyss. But it was the recordings that truly chilled their blood, the audio logs and video files that told the story of the crew's final days, of their desperate battle against the darkness that had claimed them all. They listened in horror as Evelyn's voice filled the air, as she spoke of the terrible change that had come over her, of the dark and twisted thing she had become. They watched in mute despair as Dr. Thorne's body warped and twisted, as he was consumed by the same terrible power that had claimed Evelyn's soul. And as they delved deeper into the ship's archives, as they uncovered the terrible truth that had been hidden for so long, they knew that they had stumbled upon something truly horrifying, a dark and terrible secret that threatened to consume them all. For the abyss was not just a place, not just a dark and empty void that lurked beneath the waves. It was a living thing, a vast and ancient intelligence that had slumbered for eons, waiting for the right moment to awaken and claim its rightful place as the master of all creation. And now, as the world crumbled and the last remnants of humanity fought for survival, The abyss had risen, had unleashed its terrible power upon the earth and all who dwelled upon it. Dr. Vale and his team knew that they had to act, that they had to find a way to stop the abyss before it was too late. But as they stood there, surrounded by the ruins of the research vessel and the echoes of the horrors that had claimed its crew, they knew that they were facing an impossible task, a battle that they could not hope to win. For the abyss was vast and ancient, a force beyond human comprehension. And though they might fight, though they might struggle and rage against the darkness with every ounce of strength and courage they possessed, they knew that in the end, the abyss would claim them all, that they would be swallowed up by the darkness and the terrible power that lurked within it. And so, with heavy hearts and trembling hands, they gathered what data and recordings they could and made their way back to the surface, back to a world that teetered on the brink of oblivion. They would fight, would stand against the abyss with every weapon and tool at their disposal. They would rally the remaining survivors, would build alliances and forge new bonds in the face of the coming darkness. And though they knew that the odds were stacked against them, though they knew that they might be the last of their kind, the final guardians of a world that had been lost to the abyss, they would not give up, would not surrender to the despair that threatened to consume them all. For they were the heirs of Evelyn and Dr. Thorne, the inheritors of the terrible knowledge that had been uncovered in the depths of the abyss. And though the world might never know their names, though the truth of what had happened might be lost to the ages, they would fight on, would stand tall and proud in the face of the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. And in the end, though they might fall, though they might be claimed by the abyss and the terrible power that lurked within it, they would not be forgotten, would not be consigned to oblivion and despair. For they were the survivors of the abyss, the ones who had looked into the face of madness and lived to tell the tale. And though the world might crumble and the darkness might rise, they would never stop fighting, never stop searching for a way to push back the tide and reclaim the light. And so, with a final desperate prayer, they turned their faces to the horizon and set out into the unknown, ready to face whatever horrors the abyss might unleash upon them, ready to fight and die for the chance to see the sun rise one last time. Chapter 20. The Fisherman's Tale. The old fisherman sat on the rocky shore, his weathered face turned towards the setting sun. He had seen many things in his long life, had witnessed the rise and fall of nations, the birth and death of countless generations. But nothing had prepared him for the horrors that had been unleashed upon the world, for the dark and terrible creatures that had risen from the depths to claim dominion over the earth. He had heard the stories, had listened to the whispered tales of monsters and madness, of brave heroes who had fought and died in the battle against the abyss. And though he had never seen them with his own eyes, he knew that they were true, that the world had changed in ways that few could comprehend. And so he sat there, watching the whales as they swam through the darkening sea, their haunting songs echoing across the waves like a lament for all that had been lost. He knew their story, had heard the legends passed down through the generations. They were the guardians of the deep, the ancient sentinels who had watched over the ocean since the dawn of time. And now, as the world crumbled and the abyss rose to claim its rightful place, they had returned, had risen from the depths to stand against the darkness and the terrible creatures that dwelled within it. The old fisherman watched them with a heavy heart, his mind filled with memories of a world that had been lost, of a time when the oceans had been filled with life and wonder, not darkness and despair. And as he sat there, lost in thought, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a high, keening wail that echoed across the waves like a cry of anguish and despair. He knew that sound, had heard it before in the tales of the abyss. It was the sound of a woman's voice, twisted and distorted by the dark power that had claimed her soul. And as he listened, his heart heavy with sorrow, he heard the words that had haunted his dreams for so many years, the final desperate plea of a woman lost to the darkness. "Help me," she cried, her voice echoing across the waves like a ghostly whisper. "Please, help me." The old fisherman closed his eyes, his heart breaking with the weight of her sorrow. He knew her story, had heard the tales of the woman who had been taken by the abyss, who had been transformed into a creature of darkness and despair. And though he knew that there was nothing he could do, that the woman was lost to the abyss and the terrible power that lurked within it, he could not help but feel a deep and abiding sympathy for her, a sense of kinship with a soul that had been consumed by the darkness. For he too had known loss, had felt the sting of grief and the weight of despair. And though the world might crumble and the abyss might rise, he knew that there was still hope, still a chance for redemption and renewal. And so, with a final whispered prayer, he turned his face to the sea and watched as the whales swam on, their haunting songs echoing across the waves like a promise of the world that might yet be. For though the abyss might claim them all in the end, though the darkness might swallow them whole and leave nothing but emptiness and despair, he knew that the human spirit would endure, that the light would never truly be extinguished. And as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to shine in the darkening sky, the old fisherman smiled, his heart filled with a quiet peace and a fierce, unshakable resolve. For he was a survivor of the abyss, a witness to the horrors that had claimed the world. And though the road ahead might be long and treacherous, though the darkness might rise and the monsters might roar, he would not give up, would not surrender to the despair that threatened to consume him. He would fight, would stand tall and proud in the face of the abyss, a guardian of the light in a world that had been lost to the darkness. And in the end, though he might fall, though he might be claimed by the abyss and the terrible power that lurked within it, he would not be forgotten, would not be consigned to oblivion and despair, for he was a survivor of the abyss, a keeper of the flame, in a world that had been consumed by the darkness. And though the world might crumble and the light might fade, he would never stop fighting, never stop searching for a way to push back the tide and reclaim the dawn. And so, with a final whispered prayer, the old fisherman turned his face to the stars and set out into the unknown, ready to face whatever horrors the abyss might unleash upon him, ready to fight and die for the chance to see the sun rise one last time. The end.